Good evening, and welcome to Chicago Public Library. I'm Jennifer Lezak with the Cultural, Civic, and Literary Engagement team in the Adult Services Department, and on behalf of everyone at CPL, welcome. Before we begin, we ask you to please silence your cell phones. I would like to thank the Chicago Public Library staff who worked to make this event possible. Books are available for purchase in the back of the room, and the author will sign books at the conclusion of the program. Tonight's event is also being live streamed on CPL's YouTube and Facebook channels and will be available for on-demand viewing immediately following the event. After the conversation, our guests will take questions from the audience from those who line up at the microphone in front of stage. Virtual viewers, please put your questions in the chat. Tonight, we are very pleased to welcome Neil Shubin to discuss his new book, Ends of the Earth: Journeys to the Polar Regions in Search of Life, the Cosmos, and Our Future. Chicagoan Neil Shubin is a renowned scientist, the author of Some Assembly Required, Your Inner Fish, and the Universe Within. He is the Robert R. Bensley Professor of Organismal Biology and Anatomy at the University of Chicago. He was elected to the National Academy of Sciences in 2011. Neil's new book, Ends of the Earth: Journeys to the Polar Regions in Search of Life, the Cosmos, and Our Future, takes readers on an epic adventure to the North and South Poles to reveal the secrets locked in the ice about life, the cosmos, and our planet's future. Booklist says, enlightening and often, well, chilling, his evaluation of the polar world masterfully merges discovery, appreciation, and concern. And Publishers Weekly says, this book enlightens and amazes. We are so thrilled to have Neil here tonight to share more about the mysteries of the universe. Please join us in welcoming Neil Shubin to the CPL stage.
Hi. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming out tonight. Thank you for coming out in the middle of summer to talk about Earth's polar regions. So we'll try to bring the temperature down a little bit over the next 35 minutes or so. As you heard, I'm a scientist here at the University of Chicago. I've lived in Chicago. My family and I have lived in Chicago for 26 years, actually going on 26. And for the last 4 decades, I've had the enormous privilege in working in Earth's polar regions, usually in the summer, which is the right time to work there. And I've worked in both the Arctic and Antarctica. And one thing that drove me to write this book, and one thing I want to just convey to you today, if there's one lesson I want you to leave with, it's that learning about these areas, working in these special places, in these remote places, changes the way you see the world. It changes the way you see the planet, our planet. It changes the way you see life and how it evolves on our planet. It changes the way you see yourself working in these regions. It's a really remarkable experience. And what I want to do is to open with 2 slides, one slide and one movie, that sort of capture that in a nutshell, okay? So let me give you a sense. I'm a fossil finder. So most of my job is when I go to the Arctic or Antarctica, I'm out there to find fossils that tell us about the history of life. So I'm looking at the rocks, not the ice. But I'm driven there because of the special geology of the places. And to give you a sense about how special these places are and how they can change the way you see the planet, I'm going to show you our fossil site in Antarctica. This is it. And if there's a Murphy's Law of paleontology, that law is that the best fossils are always at the tops of mountains. And this held true to form. So what we did is we would camp, and I'll show you in a second. We camped at the base of these mountains. And this is about 600 miles from the South Pole and about 300 miles from the nearest base, which is McMurdo Station in Antarctica. It's run by the U.S. Antarctic Polar Program. Our site, let's see if I can get this pointer working. Our site here was at the top of that mountain right there. So every day we'd hike up this mountain, and you can see the layers here. You see these different layers, how they lay out. Those are the geological layers. Now let me give you something remarkable. When you're standing at the top of that mountain, surrounded by ice for hundreds of miles on every side, you see nothing living. There are no birds, there are no mammals. There's nothing living that you can see with your naked eye. But inside those rocks are fossils of ancient fish and sharks in rocks that were formed in ancient rivers and streams. Now think about that disconnect for just 1 second. Today, it's a frozen waste, barren waste. I wouldn't call it a waste, that's actually not fair to me. A barren, remote area But within the rocks, you have a lush tropical rainforest of rocks that are about 380 million years old. The juxtaposition between present and past is so striking that what it does is it really shows you just how much our Earth has changed over the millennia. It's really remarkable to see what change our planet is capable on, and you see it in a nutshell standing at a mountain like that. Now, what the Arctic and Antarctica also show us is that change that is so embedded in these rocks and in that vista is also something that's happening today, and it's going to be driving our future, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that towards the end of the talk. Now, what I want to do now is, the last time I was in Antarctica was 2019, right before the COVID lockdowns. And we had a film crew with us that had a drone, and they were able to capture movies of some of the areas that we work. And what I want to show you in this movie is just to give you sort of a vivid sense of what it's like to work and be in these places. What you're going to see first, say for the first, 10 seconds of the video, is the United States' main Antarctic base called McMurdo Station. It's a science station. And scientists come and go, there's support staff there and so forth. Then we're going to cut to our field sites, and that's where you're going to see just how remarkable this juxtaposition between present and past really is. So let's just check out the movie. So first you're going to see McMurdo. We're going to fly right over it. So we're going to fly over this ridge. There's McMurdo. Hello, McMurdo. Houses about 800 people at the height of the season, about 150 at the low point. Now that's one of the fossil sites right there. That is the fossil site right at the top. That's the one you saw on the previous slide. This is camp. We camp at the base of the mountain. There's our snowmobiles in the bottom right. And we get around in these snowmobiles. It's an incredible privilege to do this kind of thing. I mean, they pay me for doing this. So you're getting, that's called Alligator Peak. That's a mountain in the distance. Just look how beautiful and special these landscapes are, what the Earth is capable of. Now this is that fossil site.
All right.
Climb to the top of that mountain. It's extremely good. Woo! Here's the deal. Crack that rock. Oh. Everything you like you see in that rock is an ancient fish bone. Scales, shark teeth, and so forth. You can see like mud cracks in that rock. It was rock that was formed in an ancient river, in an ancient lake. What's now at the top of a mountain in Antarctica was a lake. 380 years ago. That's deep, so there you go. So this is Antarctica. Now, Antarctica is a continent that's larger than the continental United States. And most of it is covered by ice. It's covered by several miles of ice. So everything you see in yellow and orange and green is ice. And it's a block of ice, or a set of blocks of ice, that are larger than the continental United States. Now here's the thing. You know how we talk about like things happen at a glacial pace, i.e. slow? Well, that's not the case of glaciers at all. When you look at the ice in Antarctica, when NASA maps how the ice moves, they could do it from remote sensing from satellites, what you notice is the ice is always moving. The ice is moving from the center, which is more or less the South Pole, towards the coast. So think about it streaming from the center of that continent to the coastline in each side, in all directions, 360 degrees around. And that ice streams between 1 and 2 kilometers a year. That's moving about half a mile to a mile a year. That ice is just moving from the center of the continent to the coast. And once it hits the coast, it stops. Sometimes it enters the ocean. And that's the thing. That movement of ice is really what affects our lives here today in so many ways. Because that movement of ice, the faster it moves, the more ice enters the ocean. The slower it moves, the less ice enters the ocean. As ice enters the ocean, it changes sea level, it changes global weather patterns and so forth. So we're finally connected to the motion of the ice in a place like Antarctica. Now that's one thing, I'll talk about it a little later. But the motion of that ice does so many remarkable and in fact surprising things. I mean, I get really excited when I talk about it. The first thing is, where we work, there are lots of crevasses. So the movement of the ice creates lots of cracks, and you're seeing one big crevasse right here. And these are actually kind of tricky for us because sometimes they can be covered by a snow bridge and you're not seeing them. And so it does occasionally happen that somebody will fall into one of these crevasses, them in their snowmobile. Fortunately, it's never happened to us. But it has happened, and you have to be very careful. So there are these deep cracks in the ice. Some of them run hundreds of feet. And when you run an expedition in these places, you have to be very mindful of these crevasses, these cracks in the ice. That's one thing. But the ice has so many surprising properties. Let me give you one. Russian teams working with French, British, and American drillers drilled an ice core in the center of the ice cap, near the center of the ice cap in Antarctica. That ice is about 2.5 miles deep. What did they find at the base of that core that they did 2.5 miles deep? They found a freshwater lake underneath the ice. It gets better. That lake, when they mapped it out, is the size of Lake Michigan underneath the ice. This lake even has islands inside of it. There's a whole world under the ice. Totally surprising. And it's a freshwater world. It's not frozen water, it's fresh water. That's one of the surprises. The other really big surprise is when they brought that water up, or at least the ice around that water up, because they didn't want to contaminate it. What did they find inside those waters? Living things. They found microbes, bacteria that are living under the ice. These are creatures that have been separated from the surface, from the rest of life on the planet for millennia, if not millions of years, perhaps as many as 15 million years. The story gets even better. When NASA used remote sensing technology from the satellites to look inside the ice, they found that there are probably about 600 of these lakes under the ice in Antarctica. It's incredible. There's whole worlds underneath the ice that contain life in our own planet. Now, NASA has taken a great interest in these, obviously, because they are one way that they're thinking about if we're going to look for life elsewhere in our solar system, where would we look? Well, two places that are under investigation right now are the frozen moons of Saturn and Jupiter, Enceladus and Europa, respectively. These are frozen worlds with ice at the base with water at the base of the ice. And they've designed probes based on the science in Antarctica to try to find that life. In fact, the Europa Clipper, which was a mission that was launched in October this year, will get to Europa in about 3 or 4 years, and we'll begin mapping the moon of Jupiter, looking for life in that time. And also what scientists are able to do is to look at those living things as well. How is life able to live separated from the sun for millennia? There are whole ecosystems where the energy is not coming directly from the sun. It's coming from the way they metabolize molecules that are in the waters underneath that. Really remarkable. Let me show you another remarkable story. When you fly to our fossil sites, you have to go over a place that's called Blood Falls, and it's very famous. Let me show you Blood Falls. This is Blood Falls. And as the name implies, it's red. It looks like a giant red fall. And when people first saw that, about 100 years ago, they thought that red was created by algae. Well, when scientists have since looked at that place, it turns out that what you have are a series of gushers that come out of the ice. The water flows out of the ice, and it's red water. And when they sampled that water, it doesn't have algae. What it is it's rust. It's oxidized iron. And it gets even better, because when they mapped what's underneath the ice here, it turns out that there's a little patch. Now we're inland here. We're about 200 miles from the coast. But underneath the ice is a little patch of ocean water that was captured by these moving glaciers millennia ago. And you have this little patch of ocean water that's sitting under the ice, and it's been getting ever saltier and saltier and saltier over the past thousands of years, actually 1.5 million years that it's been separated. And what you're seeing here is little patches of ancient ocean water that have been captured by ice, and occasionally the pressure forces that water out. Oh, and the story gets it's very similar to elsewhere. When they looked inside those waters, what did they find in that rusty, salty water? Yeah, microbes. Microbes live everywhere. We're guests on a microbial planet. You see them under the ice, you see them in Blood Falls and so forth. The other thing that this moving ice does, remember I told you that ice is moving from the center to the coast all the time. What it does is it creates these crevasses in places. We have, through the dynamic properties of ice itself, we have lakes under the ice. Also what happens is that ice is continually recycling. It's moving from the depths to the surface. So it's like a convection oven, if you will, or a convection freezer in this case, where the ice is moving around for a variety of reasons. What happens is sometimes that ice brings up meteorites to the surface. So meteorites are hitting the Earth all the time. And they hit Antarctica and the Arctic just like everywhere else. But what happens is the ice of Antarctica is like a museum of meteorites. Meteorites have hit this ice for millions of years, and they get captured in the ice over time. So what happens is as the ice moves around, it can bring ancient meteorites to the surface. And some of these meteorites, when we look at the geochemistry of them, have a similarity to rocks on the moon. Others have similarities to rocks on Mars. They're pieces of Mars that broke off during an asteroid impact and then later hit the Earth. So truly remarkable. Now, the book that I wrote is really based on my own experience as a scientist, and it's about really the special science we can do because of the ice. And because of the ice and because of the special environment in the Earth's polar regions, scientists are able to see the cosmos with great clarity. It's not just the meteorites that we can find in the ice. It's the actual telescopes that can be built at the South Pole and elsewhere that can scan the cosmos, and we can, because the measurements are so refined, they can see light that arose just after the Big Bang 13.7 billion years ago. And this is the South Pole Telescope, which has actually been designed and run by people from the University of Chicago. One of my favorite devices that monitors the cosmos is not a meteorite, is not this wonderful South Pole telescope. It's a humble little box with a nozzle on top called the Cosmic Dust Sucker. This is the Cosmic Dust Sucker. That humble little box, you could see the humble little box there. You could see the nozzle at the top. That's the sucker of the Cosmic Dust Sucker. What does this do? Well, it's a remarkable little device, always working. So think about it this way. We live on a planet that's always being rained down on by cosmic dust. You have an apartment building or a roof of a house or whatever. Your roof of your house gets 1 or 2 particles of cosmic dust hitting it each year. Little micrometeorites. You can't really see them, but they're little tiny things, and they're hitting your roof all the time, hitting the roof of the Harold Washington Library Center all the time. Now, what happens is if you want to study them in Chicago, it's kind of rough, right? Because you have other particles around. You have particles of cars and taxis and industry and so forth. But it turns out that the crystal clear and pure air of the South Pole, and this is built at the South Pole Station, is perfect for this. So the Cosmic Dust Sucker is always sucking in this pure air from about 1 kilometer from the South Pole Station. There's filters in there that collect the dust. 24/7, 365, the Cosmic Dust Sucker is doing its sucking right now in the South Pole Station. It's been doing it for about 5 years, and it's getting little particles that are hitting our planet from the solar system. And in fact, some of the particles that they found are actually pre-solar. They're particles that were formed before the formation of our solar system. Pretty remarkable stuff that you can get from these devices. And it's all because of this special environment in Earth's polar regions. So far I've been talking about ice. I've been talking about the way that a special environment can tell us about life and what it can do and what it can tell us about the cosmos. I want to shift a little bit to talk about life more in the Arctic, the kind of life I've seen working up in Greenland or Ellesmere Island and other places in the Arctic. And I want to talk a little bit about the extremes that life can go to live in these places. You heard about the microbes, but it gets even better. So, excuse me, where I work in the, up in the Arctic, we were there last July. What's remarkable about it is you're in this area, there's ice and there's rock, but there are no trees. There are no bushes. There are no shrubs. There's nothing rising high. But however, when you first look at it, you really don't see much living. Occasionally you'll see a polar bear rolling around or a muskox. But day to day, you're not going to really see much until you look down. And when you look down, you see that there is a tree there. This is the main tree up in the Canadian Arctic and Greenland. It's called the Arctic willow. It's a true willow, but it has a very special property. That's the Arctic willow. You can see its leaves there. It grows around the rock. This is a tree. It's a true willow tree. You look at its DNA, it's willow DNA. You look at its leaves, it's willow leaves. It doesn't grow up. It grows sideways. So what you'll find is a whole mat of this tree And there's little tree trunks and so forth that are lying there. And you can see the leaves. The leaves actually turn during fall. Up there, fall there is August 5th. It's a little earlier. But really remarkable. And when you find the Arctic willow, you'll start to see other living creatures as well. Ants and spiders and other sorts of things. Really sort of a very special environment because it's giving you a sense of just, the extremes that life can go to adapt there. It wouldn't work to grow tall. Why? Because the winds are so high. Because the temperatures get worse, colder and colder as you get away from the ground. As you get closer to the ground, it's warmer, less sun. So this is adapted very well to the system. Now, some people ask me, what is your favorite polar animal? And whenever I give a talk like this to kids, or I talk about the fossils we found and so forth, they always ask me, what's your favorite polar animal? And is it a polar bear? Is it a penguin? I say, nope, it's the Arctic woolly bear caterpillar. This is my favorite animal that lives in Earth's polar regions. And you're looking at this animal, and you're thinking that I'm crazy, and you're probably a little bit right there. But the reality is, I think you're going to agree with me when I tell you a little bit about the life cycle of this very special animal. All right, it's a caterpillar, and it hatches, and it grows, and it comes out around late May of every year. So right about 3 weeks ago, up in the Arctic region, it started to come out and feed. And it feeds voraciously. And it feeds voraciously on Arctic willows. Nomming Arctic willows the whole time. I mean, voraciously. For about 3.5, 4 weeks. Why? Because that's the warm season there. Then it gets cold starting in August, late July, early August. It starts getting cold, and then the woolly bear caterpillar retreats and hibernates. So it has 3.5, 4, 5 weeks to feed, and what it's doing is it's feeding like crazy and storing energy, and then it goes into hibernation for virtually the rest of the year, till next May. Freezes over, solid, and then it thaws out, then it feeds voraciously for another 5 weeks or so, stores that energy, freezes over again as the world freezes, does that cycle 7 times. Thaws, feeds, stores energy, freezes, thaws, feeds, stores energy, freezes. You get the idea, right? Freeze, thaw, feeding, storing energy for 7 years. On the 8th year, it metamorphoses into a moth, flies around for about 5 or 6 days, reproduces, and dies. A whole life cycle to spend a week-ish flying and then reproducing and then before passing away. And all that is made possible by this life cycle that enables it to store food that took over 7 years to do that. Now, how does it do all this? Well, first of all, it has all those hairs around it, right? The woolly bear caterpillar. We have a version of it down here, the woolly bear caterpillar. In fact, if you fly fish, the woolly bugger, if you fish with that, that's one of a cousin of this. This one has really long hairs. And so what it does is it'll hover on these rocks and absorb heat. Because remember, it's daylight 24 hours a day there. And so it's just sucking in the heat, and those little hairs keep the heat in the body. So that's one thing. But then the other thing it has, the reason why it's able to freeze over and thaw without destroying its cells, look, if my hand was to freeze and then thaw again, we call that frostbite. How is this able to do that without getting like a caterpillar version of frostbite? The way it does it is it has in its body a special protein. It has an antifreeze protein. It has an antifreeze in its body that it makes naturally that stops the ice crystals from binding to the cells and destroying those cells. It turns out that there are all kinds of other polar creatures that have antifreeze proteins in their bodies and blood as well. There are fish that have antifreeze proteins, worms that have antifreeze proteins, caterpillars, of course. So antifreeze proteins are really very common in these areas. And in many cases, they're a modified protein, very simply modified protein from other parts of the body. Like in fish, they'll have a modified liver enzyme that forms this antifreeze protein. And the similar sort of thing for the caterpillar. It's not from a liver modification, but it's from their blood. In fact, some of these antifreeze proteins and some of these proteins or abilities are so special. There's one worm that when it goes into this sort of hibernation, just like the woolly bear caterpillar does. But what it does is it trades all its water in its body for a sugar called trehalose. And what it does is it gets rid of all the water in its body when the weather gets bad, and it replaces all the water with a sugar called trehalose, and it turns into a glass. That is, by replacing all the water with the sugar, you can basically take a hammer to this worm and it'll shatter. So they turn into a kind of glass, and they sit in the suspended animation as a glass for a period of time until the weather gets better, i.e. it rains or snows or what have you, you have more water, and then it thaws out and rehydrates and can live again. And it can stay in this state for dozens of years. In fact, there are some microbes and some bacteria that have stay in stasis for 50,000 or more years. So there's all kinds of strategies that animals use. Now, when you work in these environments, you see some amazing things. And one of the things that really struck me once was, walking where we are, we're looking at these rocks, right? And we're looking for the fossils in the rocks. And there's not a lot of life there. You'll see some Arctic willows. You'll see the woolly bear caterpillars, things like that. But you have to look really carefully for them. Every now and then you'll see a patch of green. And it stands out. There's white, there's the red of the rocks, but then there's a bright green patch. When you walk up to those green patches, almost invariably, what you'll see are horns of a muskox sticking out of a green patch with moss growing on top of them. And once you spot this, you'll look around and you'll see another green patch, maybe about, a quarter of a mile away. You'll run to that one, and guess what you'll find? A muskox horn sticking out of there. Here you can see its horns. You can see its jaw in the front there. What happens is part of the life cycle, part of the ecology of these areas really depends on decaying carcasses. That is, this muskox spent 30, 40 years roaming around slowly around the Arctic, eating Arctic willows every summer voraciously, covering hundreds of miles, died in this spot, and all those nutrients that formed its body are now being released by decomposition to form a little garden. We call them muskox gardens, because if you look really closely here, you'll find small flowers, you'll find small mushrooms, you'll find a whole ecosystem created by a decaying carcass. Just really remarkable ecosystems that have all these special properties. It takes really special adaptations to live here, and by understanding these adaptations, we get to understand what life can really do, the extremes that life can go to. In fact, some of the extremes we can see are the extremes that people can go to. And I want to share a story of the extremes that people have gone to make scientific discoveries, because I think it gives a sense of, a lot of the things I'm talking to you right now about were gained by knowledge of people who worked and studied in these areas for millennia. It started with the indigenous communities that have worked and lived up there, extended to European investigators, scientists, explorers, and so forth. And some of the things these people went through were truly remarkable. And I want to talk about one very famous one. And it's a longish story, but it has a point and has a very strong scientific point as well. And I'm going to show you this group here. This is Robert Falcon Scott. I don't know if many of you know, but to attain the South Pole, that was a dream for many countries. That is, to gain the South Pole would be to gain an entire continent. And the British launched an expedition. This is in the early part of 1912, 1914, 1912. Launched an expedition led by the person in the center here, Robert Falcon Scott, to attain the pole. And he ran a big expedition, and they actually, they set up a little base near McMurdo Station, what is today McMurdo Station. And then he sent a small team of 5 people to get to the pole. Now, the pole is a long hike. It's about a 600 to 700 mile hike from the coast. And the South Pole sits at about 10,000 feet. So not only did they have to sledge 600 miles to get to the pole, they had to climb 10,000 feet in Antarctica. Do you have any idea how cold that is? The average temperature of the South Pole is about -20, and it's about that on a warm day. Well, it's -10 on a warm day, and it can get down to -80. And so these gentlemen, these 5, made it to the South Pole. And they attained the South Pole for Britain. Do they look happy? I don't think so. This guy does. I'm going to explain him in a second. You know why? Not only was it arduous, when this British team got to the South Pole, they found a tent with a Norwegian flag. Roald Amundsen led a Norwegian team of expert cross-country skiers that beat Scott's team there by about 6 weeks. And by the time that Scott got to the South Pole, Amundsen was already home. So what you're seeing here are people not only who have suffered the extremes of what the what the polar region can do, but you're seeing just incredible disappointment. They're shattered by what happened. They were beaten to the pole. Now, they were all, sadly, all to perish on the way home, and they died one by one. However, this guy here, look at him. His hands are right there on his sides. Kind of got a jaunty look. He's undeterred. That's Edward Wilson. He was the ship's naturalist. He was the ship's Charles Darwin, if you will. He was their doctor as well. And he drew notes of everything. He was a scientist to the very end. And what he did was, right after they took this picture of them essentially defeated, what did he do? Ever the scientist? I found this in his field notes. You could see his field notes there at Cambridge University at the Scott Polar Research Center. I was holding his field notes, and in it is a diagram of the Norwegian tent. He actually, ever the scientist, measured the tent, drew the flag, did scientific notes. He was his drawings, his maps, his analyses, they were so beautiful. You know, from this defeat they had, he really turned it into a study, and he called this Polheim. Polheim was the pole city, pole town in Norwegian. Anyway, so that's Edward Wilson. And as they left the pole, and about 8 weeks later, they were all to die. The first one to perish was this gentleman here. He had an injury. The next one to perish had a knee that went out, and he was holding up the team. And he realized he was holding up the team to getting to the base. And they're all in the tent during a horrific storm. And he realized, even if the weather gets better, he's just going to hold the team up. So in the middle of a big storm, he said to the gentleman, this is recorded in Scott's notes, "I'm going to go outside now. I might be some time." He left the tent to die. It was one of the most epic lines in all of Arctic work. So that's Lieutenant Oates. The three, Scott, Bertie Bowers, and Wilson died for lack of food, and they couldn't, because of the storm. They died 11 miles from a supply depot, sadly. They didn't know it was there. Anyway, about 3 weeks before they perished, after this, they were beaten. They stopped on the way down from the pole because there were rocks that Edward Wilson wanted to draw. They already lost one guy, and he wanted to draw some rocks. And he did a geological map of those rocks and collected some of those rocks. All right, so they die in their tent. Wilson did his diagrams and all this stuff. 6 months later, a rescue team comes. They found they couldn't rescue them because they were perished in the tent. They found the three bodies. They found Scott with his arm around Wilson. They found Scott's notes. And what did they find next to Scott's tent, which they carried with them to the very end? 60 pounds of plant fossils that Edward Wilson collected to the very end. They couldn't carry themselves, but he was going to carry these fossils. Well, what are these fossils? This is a fossil plant known as Glossopteris. It's from Triassic Age rocks that Wilson was plugged in enough to know what they were. But guess what? These are found in Antarctica, but they're the same species that was found in Africa, South America, and Australia. This was some of the earliest evidence for continental drift, that the continents of Antarctica, Africa, Australia, and South America were once connected. There was a big piece of that. And this was what was next to their tent. Tell me that is not just incredible science to the very end. I mean, really remarkable sort of stuff. Now, nowhere near as epic. My team has worked up there to find fossils. And again, not epic at all. But what we're interested in is the transition from life in water to life on land. And where we have worked is up in Ellesmere Island. So we're up here in the northern part. So there's the North Pole in the upper left here. And we're in these islands here. See where my pointer is up there in the upper left, in these islands here. Zoom into the islands here. Everything in red, that's circled in red, those are rocks that we've worked on over the years. And we found a fish in rocks about 375 million years old, this fish, Tiktaalik rosea. It's a fish we found, a fish fossil we found, that has arm bones and leg bones. It has lungs and gills. It's one of the first creatures, fish, to walk on land. And it gives you a sense about the discovery that's possible in these special places. That is, there's so much to discover there. I mean, we worked for about 6 years to find this thing. We've since found more of them. But honestly, one can spend multiple careers studying the fossils, the geology, the plants, doing the science in these special regions. I'll cut a little bit. And I just want to end with something about our future, and then I'll take your questions. This is that slide I showed earlier. This is Antarctica. Remember, I showed this slide earlier to show you that the ice is moving, right? Now, the ice, when you think about what's happening to the ice, in the center of Antarctica, the ice is actually growing. That's good news, right? No, not bad news. It's not all that good, though. The problem is, where the ice is melting fastest, where it's actually at a critical point, is the ice that's at the coast. Remember I told you the ice is flowing from the center of Antarctica to the coast, and that rate is speeding up? What's happening, though, is most of the warming is not affecting the interior of the continent of Antarctica. It's affecting the coastline. Why? Because you have warm waters of the Southern Ocean, which are warming, approaching the ice at the coast of Antarctica. And as that melts, that ice that's sitting at the coastline enters the ocean. And when that ice enters the ocean, it melts and can change global sea levels. So that process of melting ice at the coastline is something that scientists have been keeping an eye on for some time now. And because as we look at that, you can project what sea levels may be over the next century or so. And there are wide ranges. I mean, so we know sea level is going to increase. The question is how much. It could be as little as 6 to 7 inches. It could be as much as 10 feet. And a lot of that depends on what's happening at the ice along the coast of Antarctica. So stay tuned to that. That's a very important thing. Another important thing, and this is where I want to close, is something that you're not reading about in the news, but over the next 5 years, you're going to read about it a whole lot. I want you to look at this map. This is a map of the North Pole with all the ice removed. So I took out the ice from the north, the whole Arctic region, and all you're seeing is the sea floor of the Arctic, right? Everybody got that? And right in the center of the slide, right here, is where the North Pole is. Now, I want to call your attention to this ridge, this mountain ridge, that's going from Greenland and Ellesmere Island on one side to Siberia on the other. Does everybody see that? It's that mountain ridge. It's called the Lomonosov Ridge. It has a special property. Ridges in the center of the ocean are usually formed by seafloor, but this one is not. This ridge, because of continental drift and plate tectonic, this ridge is actually made of continental rocks, rocks that were originally formed on land hundreds of millions of years ago. Now, why does that matter? Well, because the Russians, seeing those rocks, claim that those rocks were originally part of Siberia, and that would give them a claim to the entire sea floor, about an area 2 to 3 times the size of Texas, beneath the North Pole, as part of their law, their boundaries of the law of the sea. But guess what? Those rocks are also similar to rocks in northern Greenland and rocks in Ellesmere Island. What that means is, because of the vagaries of the law of the sea and continental shelf and boundaries and so forth, that each of those countries has been able to make a claim to the UN Committee on Law of the Sea to claim an area underneath the North Pole about 2 to 3 times on the seafloor, 2 or 3 times the size of the state of Texas. The biggest area under contest in the entire planet is in Earth's polar regions, and 3 countries are vying for that region. Now, why does that matter? Well, because with the changes in the Arctic is heating between 4 and 7 times faster on average than anywhere else on the planet. As that ice melts, sea routes become navigable, and you can traverse those sea routes across there. All of a sudden, the sea floor becomes open for mining and mineral extraction and resource extraction. So the economic value of these areas become ever more apparent and become ever more urgent for countries. And that's why these 3 countries are making such a play for this area. Each of those 3 countries has made a claim for the area. And Russia's claim was approved. Denmark and Canada have also made claims, and they're seeking to have theirs approved in the next 5 to 7 years. So keep an eye on that, because that's not only are polar regions heating in terms of temperature, they're heating up geopolitically. So what I wanted to do for these past 40 minutes or so is to give you a sense of just how special these areas are. That once we understand ice, it's so surprising. There are whole worlds to discover below the ice, above the ice, in the rocks, in the creatures that live there. And when you do that, it really does change the way you see the world. It changes the way you see the planet. It changes the way you see the cosmos. It changes the way you see other living things. And it changes the way you see yourself. Because we are ultimately connected to what happens in these places. These are not remote places that are just, not a part of our lives. What happens at the poles does not stay at the poles. It affects our lives further south and north. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions?
And if you have a question, we're asking you to come down here so that our live stream audience can hear your question. I'll start with a question from one of our virtual viewers. It says, as a scientist and a writer, how do you combat all the misinformation out there, especially about science topics?
How do I what about them? I'm sorry?
Combat all the misinformation out there, especially about science topics.
Well, it's hard to do. Part of the challenge with sort of the information landscape we're in is there are so many vehicles for, we're flooded with information, and it's hard to have a filter on what's trusted information, what's not trusted information. It's very hard. I find, speaking very personally, that I think the most effective way for me to get information to people really comes down to finding the right stories to convey that information. That is, if I could tell a discovery story, like Edward Wilson, the fact of that Glossopteris changes you'll remember it in a different way. It also creates a sense of what is reliable information versus what's not reliable information. That is, if you choose the stories of discovery right, it can really be a game changer for how you evaluate information. Now, we're not going to get rid of misinformation. There's just all kinds of information up there. And what I tell my students is, you're being flooded by information. What the most effective way to become a scientist or write a good paper or be a student is really to have a filter to see what is high quality information, what is less high quality information, what is lousy information, how to be able to do that. Sometimes stories are the way to do that, to understand the discovery stories, how it was known. In other cases, it really kind of means knowing the landscape of how did that discovery come about, and what are the supporting facts around that evidence. So it's a complicated world we're living in right now because standard sources of information like the media and the National Academy of Sciences or whatever, they're competing against TikTok and podcasters and so forth. And so there's a lot of attention for people's eyeballs. And information is a very tricky thing because sometimes truth can get lost in the whole world of misinformation because truth can sometimes be challenging. Truth can sometimes run against our own personal viewpoint. It could be a challenging thing to accept. It could be a challenging thing to find truthful information, understand the truthful information. So I think telling the stories about how we find reliable information, and then being really kind of open-minded about presenting it, not in a partisan way, but in a way this is following the facts.
I have a few questions. I'm not sure how many I can ask, but I was wondering, what's the earliest kind of fossil you found in a polar region, like Cambrian era?
Yeah, we found, Cambrian, yes. We found Cambrian age fossils, so about 520, 530 million years old. So to do that, we led an expedition to northern Ellesmere Island. It was a whole different area we went to. This was about in 2014. We thought we'd try something different. So we went to an area about the northern tip of land in Canada, and we found trilobites and other things like that, kind of right around the Cambrian explosion period.
Have you seen any kinds of radiodonts or like radiodonts?
No, we haven't found any of those. We found arthropods and things like that.
Can I ask another question?
Okay, great, thank you.
I remember I saw that there was this kind of historic base that was like kept for like I don't know. I forgot if it was like Scott base or something.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you've seen that.
Oh, yeah. So right down the hill from McMurdo Station is one of Shackleton's original bases and Scott's bases.
I just remember there were like skeletons in there. And,
Oh,
like,
yeah.
a
it's incredible.
taxidermy
So you
penguin.
go-
It's
and
really
every
creepy.
now and then they'll open it up for you to go in, and you can't touch anything. But you see their cans of their food stacked up. You see a desk. There's a seal carcass outside that they were storing, but they left it there. There are no human bodies there, but there are, like the carcasses of some of the seals they shot that they were waiting to eat on. And that's just one in the South Pole. There's another one towards the north called the Peary Station, where Admiral Peary, before he did his shot for the North Pole, there's one up there. Fort Conger is still up there as well. The U.S. had an old base. One of the craziest stories is the U.S. built a base under the ice in the late 50s with an idea that maybe we can store nuclear weapons there via rapid launch for protected by the ice, but also rapid launch to attack the Soviet Union if we needed to do that sort of strike. And they put a base underneath the ice, and that base is still underneath the ice. It's been changed because remember the ice moves, so it's all messed up now, but it's still there.
This is kind of a silly question, but have you ever seen glacier mice?
Glacier
Like-
ice? Yeah, all the time, yeah. We drink it. In fact, it's one of the greatest things in the world. So we'll go out and you can hit it, and it's like blue ice.
No, I mean mice, like glacier mice.
Oh, mice. I thought you said
Yeah.
ice. I was like, I have to give a talking. No, I've not. No.
I've just heard that there's been like colonies of like mothballs. And
Well, we'll find lemmings up there. There are lemmings so when you set up a tent, your tent is a warm spot underneath the tent, and so lemmings will sometimes like set up a little dwelling underneath your tent. So you'll be lying there at night. Well, there's no night; it's daylight, but at 3 a.m, and you'll see the floor of your tent bouncing around. That's usually a lemming underneath the tent floor.
Hi, I was wondering if you have any idea of these lakes under the ice, could they hold larger life forms like a vertebrate or even a worm or something like that?
That's the million-dollar question, right? So, and here's the puzzling finding. So one of the microbes that the team found is highly specialized to live in the guts of fish. They haven't found fish. Now remember, they've only sampled, you can only drill down and sample the water, so you're not really getting a picture of what's living there. But they found a microbe that suggests there may be some sort of vertebrate under there. Now it could be just that this is just a microbe that looks similar to that, but it has the metabolic properties that similar to those kinds of microbes that inhabit guts of fish and other creatures.
Cool, thanks.
Stay tuned because they are. NSF the National Science Foundation has ran a number of expeditions to look at these lakes of like 5-6 years ago, and their results just be coming out in the next few years. So who knows?
Thanks for coming. What is the current speculation? I have 3 questions. I'm going to go real quick. What is the current speculation or hypothesis on why this is warming so fast and so quickly? Do we know all the currents involved? Is it current-driven from our other oceans? And that question. My second question is, what do you say to your family when you leave for these trips? And the third question is, I love how holistic, I saw the Inner Fish series and read your books. I love how holistic your your discussions involve a stretch into other genres and information. And you referred to some literature in your writing. And I'm wondering if you read In Ascension, climate fiction of a woman trained to do this expedition to another planet and drive into the ocean there. It's a great
No,
book.
haven't read that. I look forward to it. So definitely suggest. What's the name of what's the title?
In Ascension.
In Ascension. No, I haven't read that.
Yeah,
Sorry.
maybe I can get it to you at your.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thank you. First, what do I say to my family? Well, back in the day, about over 20 years ago, we didn't have satellite phones. So I would go to the Arctic, and that would be it. I wouldn't, had no contact home for a month or two. And I'd send letters home through the helicopter pilots when they would move us. And typically I'd be home by the time those letters arrived. But nowadays there's a satellite phone, so typically I'll give a call every few days. But what do I say? I'll say, see you in a few months. I will bring back all kinds of goodies, pictures and stories and so forth, and that I have this great privilege to explore the world and understand our world, and it's an incredible privilege, and we're going to make the most of it these next few months. It can be challenging. Working in Antarctica is probably the most challenging because the height of the austral summer is December 22nd, December 21st, right? And so you have to leave right around Thanksgiving, and you come back in February. So you'll miss Thanksgiving, you'll miss Christmas, Hanukkah, birthdays, New Year's, you name it. Whatever, name the holiday, that's kind of the time. And so that's kind of a rough time to go. But in terms of why the polar region, the Arctic is heating so fast, there's a couple things going on. One are ocean currents. But the other major thing is what's called Arctic amplification. So as the ice melts, so ice reflects sunlight. But the oceans are dark and the rocks are dark. So as you lose ice, it holds more heat there. So as you're getting this feedback loop that as you lose more ice, the area heats up more quickly because you lose the albedo effect. And so that's one of the reasons why the Arctic is heating so fast, because they're in that amplification process. You don't have that situation in Antarctica. Why? Because Antarctica is a continent. Most of the ice in the Arctic is over ocean. That's the difference. And the ocean waters are warmer. So that's why, whereas the ice over Antarctica is over continent. So it's a very different sort of setting, and also at altitude. So that's why the Arctic and Antarctica are very different, and that's why the Arctic has this amplification in temperature. Yeah.
Hello. You said one of your research areas was looking for creatures who transitioned, I guess, from ocean creatures to land roving creatures, and I'm wondering when you developed a hypothesis about this, and why the Arctic region is a place to explore this, or a place where you can find evidence for this.
Yeah, thank you. Great question. Yeah, so the reason, so we started the work up in the Arctic for that critter in 1998. And what drove us there was a hypothesis that this would be the place to find it. Why? 3 facts. 1, the place held rocks of the right age to answer the question. So based on other studies, we had a hypothesis that this would be the right window of time, of age of rock to look at, about 380 to 375 million years. That was when it happened. We wanted rocks that geologists had already mapped, and we wanted rocks that we mapped of that right age. So the first thing is we had rocks of the right age, based on what other people had studied. The second thing we looked for is rocks of the right type to hold these fossils. Not every kind of rock can hold a fossil. We wanted rocks that were formed in ancient rivers and streams. We wanted rocks that were formed in very gentle, gradual conditions that would not break up the fossils. So we made a geological hypothesis that certain kinds of sedimentary rocks would hold these fossils. Finally, we went there because these rocks of the right age and the rocks of the right type, where you didn't have the ice, were exposed to the surface. So we had whole areas of rocks of the right age and the right type that, well, largely because of warming, of melting ice, that were exposed to the surface, and that turned out to be. And then when we found the fish, it's very clear. It's a fish with shoulder, elbow, wrist, even parts of finger, within fin bones. It has gills and lungs. It has all, so it's right at the cusp of the change.
I think we have time for one final question. I have a question from a young person who's watching virtually. What advice would you give someone who's hoping to be a scientist and study the poles?
And study the poles. The first thing, I think the advice I give is to read a lot. I that was the best advice is just read about other discoveries, read about explorers, read about indigenous communities, read about these areas. And there's so many resources out there where you can learn and read. And it really will give you a sense of what's happening in these places. You have online resources, you have resources at a fabulous library like this. You know, there's just so much you're able to read and do. And then when you go to school, I mean, I think, you know, honestly, I'm a big believer in liberal arts education. I really believe some of my most important classes were not my science classes. Science classes were very important, but other things as well. So it's very important to get a balanced education in many different fields. And so read a lot, be curious, go to museums, watch documentaries, and try to get as much understanding of different fields of inquiry, of knowledge as possible. And it will not hurt you no matter what you do in life.
One more round of applause for Neil Shubin. Thanks to Neil. Thanks to all of you for being here. I will remind you that if you're interested in science and nature and in the environment, the Chicago Public Library's summer reading program is going on now, and our theme this summer is nature and environment. So check out all of our information about other programs related to science at chipublib.org/summer. Check out Neil's book at your local Chicago Public Library branch. Books are for sale in the lobby, and he will be signing books down here in just a minute. So if you'd like to have your book signed, we'd ask you to just line up on the right side of the stage here, and we'll get to you in just a minute.